Come join me on my second channel, Jaguar Gator 8, where we'll talk all things college football. New video drops every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch the latest video. And now, on with our feature presentation. This is former Cincinnati Bengals quarterback Jordan Palmer. I want you to imagine this bizarre scenario. Somehow, Joe Burrow gets hurt, and it's a nasty injury that leaves him out for the season. Imagine if, immediately after Burrow got hurt, Palmer called up the Bengals and asked him if he could play for them. He calls them up and says, "I see you need a quarterback. Perhaps I could be of assistance." Like he's Clippy from Microsoft Word or something. Your reaction is probably, and understandably so, one of laughter and disbelief. Are you out of your mind? You haven't played since 2014. It's been 8 years since you even stepped foot on a field, and it's not like you were even that good when you were playing. Now you're 38 years old, and you're genuinely asking if you could sign with us, despite not having played in the NFL in nearly a decade? Are you out of your mind? Well, I bring all of that up because someone actually tried that once. Seriously. Shoot your shot, I guess. This is New Orleans Saints quarterback John Fourcade, and when you look at his numbers and what he did in the NFL, most people rightfully assume that his career ended in 1990. However, you might not know about the laughably bad and failed comeback attempt that he tried to make at 38 years old in 1998. And the result was pretty predictable, considering the circumstances. This is the story behind one of the dumbest quarterback moments in the history of the New Orleans Saints, and the failed comeback attempt gone horribly wrong. Before I talk about the actual comeback in question, we need some context to understand just who John Fourcade is, as in, the person trying to make this comeback. And to fully tell our story, we have to go all the way back to 1987, when the strike was taking place and when the replacement games were going on. As for 3 weeks, NFL teams tried to fill their rosters with players off the street. Most of these guys, predictably, were terrible. The quality of play was atrocious, and just about every single one of these guys was out of the NFL the moment that the strike ended and the regular players resumed. If they did stick around, it was for the rest of the year in a backup role, and that was it. However, there were a select few guys that actually showed that they belonged in the NFL, and perhaps the biggest success story was none other than John Fourcade. After Fourcade went 2-1 in the replacement games, including a great game against the Los Angeles Rams, where he threw 3 touchdown passes and completed over 76% of his passes, he was one of just 11 strike players that the Saints kept around. As a side note, and as an NFL historian, I would not be doing my job correctly if I did a video on John Fourcade and didn't show you this play from the Rams game, which didn't count, but might be the greatest and craziest play that didn't count in the history of the NFL.
John Fourcade of the New Orleans Saints authored one of the wildest plays in pro football history against the Rams in 1987.
Up, throwing deep down the near sideline. It's going to be picked off back to the 40, 45, to the 50, to the 45 of the Saints. The ball comes loose. Another Ram has picked it up. This is a lineman. This one's going to be seen on the highlights for a long, long time. 28 looking to lateral it. The ball goes loose and the Saints have it. It's Fourcade. He's got it at the 40, 45, 50, 40, 30, 25, 20, 10, into the end zone for the touchdown.
Anyways, crazy clip aside, Fourcade not only stayed on the roster as a backup quarterback throughout the 1987 season, but was one of the few replacement players in the entire NFL to stay on beyond that. He was on the team in 1988, and in 1989 was even named the starting quarterback for 3 games. Fourcade started the final 3 games of the 1989 season, and he played really well, throwing 7 touchdowns and just 3 interceptions, as the Saints won all 3 of them, with all 3 of those wins against the Bills, Eagles, and Colts being against teams that entered the day above 500. It was a true feel-good story. The guy waited until he was 29 years old to start his first non-strike game in the NFL, and spent 8 years either on the bench or in other football leagues waiting for his moment. And when the time came following the benching of a struggling Bobby Hebert, he made the most of it. As Fourcade said, "After you've been in 4 leagues and been playing for 8 years and really haven't gotten the opportunity to start, you begin wondering, am I just going to be a backup? Will I ever get a chance to be a starter for an NFL club? But I just worked my way up the ladder. When I got the word that I'd be starting, I was very excited about the opportunity." You couldn't help but root for the guy. And in 1990, Fourcade was going to be starting for the Saints as their opening day guy. the team was hoping that he could do what he did at the end of 1989, and do what he did during the strike, and play at a high level. After spending a decade as a backup and an outcast, now this was clearly his team. And that's where the feel-good story comes to a screeching halt, because at that moment, Fourcade crashed back down to Earth. He didn't just crash back down to Earth, he went through the Earth's surface. That's how hard he crashed. In his first 2 starts of the season, the Saints went 0-2, losing 13-12 to the San Francisco 49ers and 32-3 to the Minnesota Vikings. In those 2 games combined, the Saints failed to score a single touchdown, and scored 3 points combined in the second half. In those 2 games, Fourcade went 21 for 57, completing less than 37% of his passes, while throwing no touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and posting a passer rating of 17.7, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Fourcade's seat was now burning hot, and in Week 5, when the Saints hosted the Browns in the Superdome, he had to play well to keep his starting job. Alas, he did not. On his penultimate snap, he threw this pass. He's extremely lucky that this was not picked off, as generally speaking, you don't want your quarterbacks throwing into double coverage like that. And on his final snap, he muffed it, and though he made a nice attempt to recover and salvage the play, he was well short of the first down, bringing the Boo Birds out. At that point, head coach Jim Mora had seen enough, and benched him for Steve Walsh, the newly acquired quarterback who was controversially drafted in the first round of the 1989 NFL Supplemental Draft by the Dallas Cowboys. Fourcade never started another game for the Saints again, and he was left unprotected by the team in Plan B free agency. Fourcade loved playing for New Orleans. He grew up in Louisiana, and played high school football at Archbishop Shaw, which is 8 miles away from the Superdome. New Orleans was, for all intents and purposes, his hometown, and he really wanted to stay, especially after working so hard to get to this point. As Fourcade said, "This is my hometown. I love it here. I got a chance to play here. I'm looking at it as if I'm still part of the New Orleans Saints." However, no team picked him up in free agency, the Saints didn't bring him back, and his NFL career was done. Today, Fourcade remains an interesting footnote in the over half-century-long history of the Saints franchise. It is remembered as the surprising hero of the 1987 strike, as well as the shocking out-of-nowhere Cinderella story from the end of the 1989 season. At least, that's how most people remember Fourcade. What you might not realize is that this is not the end of his time with the Saints. Far from it, in fact. Because 8 years later, he had a rather bizarre request. He wanted to come back and play for them again. On September 6, 1998, the New Orleans Saints opened up the season with a 24-17 victory on the road against the St. Louis Rams. That was the good news. The bad news was that during this game, their starting quarterback ruptured his right Achilles tendon and was out for the season. Just like that, the Saints needed a new quarterback. And the moment that happened, John Fourcade decided that he was going to throw his hat into the ring. He wanted to rejoin the Saints and become their next quarterback. So much so that he called up Mike Ditka and the Saints organization to try and make it happen. Now on the surface, you might see some major problems with that. For one, this was 1998. The last time Fourcade was even on an NFL roster was all the way back in 1990, and it's not like he was good back then, so I can't imagine what he'd be like now at 38 years old. The last time Fourcade played in an NFL game, Operation Desert Storm had not yet happened, the new kids on the block were still, kids. There had only been one Terminator movie released, the Soviet Union was still a thing, and Janet Jackson was still releasing #1 singles from her album Rhythm Nation 1814, which came out back in 1989. And yet, he thought that the Saints should legitimately sign him, despite the fact that it had been roughly a decade since he last stepped foot on an NFL field, and since then had only bounced around a few teams in the Arena Football League on and off. I know you might think the Saints are desperate, but come on, man, they're not that desperate. And you might be saying that a part of why this happened was the Steve DeBerg effect. Earlier in 1998, the Atlanta Falcons decided that they were going to sign DeBerg as their backup quarterback to Chris Chandler, even though DeBerg had not played in the NFL since 1993 when he was with the Miami Dolphins, and even though DeBerg was 44 years old. I guess the logic was that if DeBerg could do it, so could Fourcade. However, there's a few major flaws with that argument. Number one, DeBerg was reuniting with Dan Reeves, who was now the head coach of the Falcons, but used to be the head coach of the Denver Broncos when he was there. DeBerg knew the system, he knew the plays, he knew his style, and knew how things worked. DeBerg was a plug-and-play kind of guy. With Fourcade, it was not like that. Yes, it was the same team in New Orleans, but he never played under head coach Mike Ditka before. He'd have to learn all the terminology and whatnot, and while that's definitely doable, especially for Fourcade, who is a bright mind who's played in a lot of different places and learned a lot of different playbooks, it's not even close to DeBerg's situation, where there was no learning curve whatsoever. Number 2, DeBerg was, actually a good quarterback. Yes, he had been out of the league for quite some time, but at the very least, when DeBerg was in his prime, he could play. He even got some MVP votes back in 1990 when he threw 23 touchdowns and just 4 interceptions as a member of the Kansas City Chiefs. And many people make the argument today that in the post-merger era, he might be the greatest quarterback of all time to never make it to a Pro Bowl. He finished inside the top 7 in passing yards 3 times, finished inside the top 10 in passing touchdowns 4 times, and led multiple teams to the postseason, including a stint in Kansas City where he won 21 games in his final 2 seasons there as the starter. John Fourcade, on the other hand, he had some good games against plumbers and delivery men, had a good 3-game stretch to end the 1989 season, and other than that, nothing. He was one of the worst starting quarterbacks in football in 1990 before he got yanked for Steve Walsh. I don't think a single person in America was wondering whether or not Fourcade still had anything left in the tank by 1998. And number 3, even despite DeBerg being out of the league since the end of the 1993 season, guess what? That's still 3 years less than Fourcade. I only bring up this comparison because the Saints offensive coordinator said it himself that this was the only reason that Fourcade thought he could make it at this stage, calling it the Steve DeBerg syndrome. But again, that is a gross oversimplification of the issue, because it at least made some logical sense why the Falcons thought DeBerg could come back. Why Fourcade thought he could come back after 8 years out of the league when he was never very good to begin with, I have no idea. But sometimes, you just need someone to tell you to snap back to reality, and to wake up from this fantasy world that you're living in. And that's where the incredibly blunt Mike Ditka comes into the equation. Because when Fourcade put in that request, Ditka almost immediately, like the dude who still wears his varsity jacket in his 40s, told him, "You've got to step into the real world and move on. This is not going to happen." As Ditka said, "I'm interested in playing tight end, but I can't do it anymore. I think there comes a time in life where you have to let go. I think the world of John, but we're going to go in a different direction." It was an extremely nice way of saying, you need to move on, and accept the fact that you're never going to be an NFL player again. There is an incredible quote in Moneyball, my favorite sports movie of all time, that says, "We're all told at some point in time that we can no longer play the children's game. We just don't know when that's going to be. Some of us are told at 18, some of us are told at 40, but we're all told." And for John Fourcade, Mike Ditka just gave him that moment. That's not to say you can't still work in football. Far from it, in fact. Fourcade spent a ton of time afterwards coaching various football teams in different leagues. But his NFL playing days were done. His dream was gone. On the surface, the idea of a 38-year-old who has been retired for 8 years asking to be the team's new quarterback seems funny. But when you dive deeper, and especially when you break down Ditka's quote, it's a somewhat tragic and sad tale of a guy seemingly being unable to accept his fate and his ability, and being unable to let the past go. So what's the moral of the story? By all means, go for your dreams and shoot for the stars. But there has to be a point where you have to be realistic. And for John Fourcade, if you've been out of the NFL for 8 years, and were never even a very good NFL player to begin with, then it's probably time to focus your attention on something else. Everyone in life has to know when to move on. And unfortunately for John Fourcade, he definitely found this out the hard way. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.